Good evening. We are showing about 41 participants at this point. We're going to get started with the program. I'm Dave Kartunen with the Parmenter Foundation. I produce media and provide other consulting services to the organization. We'd like to thank you for joining us tonight for this wonderful event with New York Times bestselling author Hope Edelman. We think this is going to be a wonderful experience to both see and feel the incredible support that she's been able to offer over the years through her new books, through her two books. And we're going to be able to hear a brief excerpt from her new book, The AfterGrief, which is, of course, the title of tonight's event. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, there is accessibility options for the hearing impaired for tonight's event. You can toggle this through the CC live transcript option at the bottom of your screen. If you need accessibility options, you can toggle it on. If it starts to become entrancing or distracting for you at the bottom of the screen, you can also toggle it off. We also have time at the end for some question and answer. You can enter that into the Q&A panel now. There is a moderator who will be moderating the questions and teeing them up for later in the evening. We will hear a brief excerpt from Hope's book, and then we'll introduce you to a panelist of young adults who have been participating in the HEARTplay program in Wayland, Massachusetts. And they'll get to share parts of their stories and ask questions of Hope and share some of those experiences together, not only about the power of her books and her programs, but also the experiences of young adults in our community in MetroWest Boston. So I'd also like you to know that after this event is over, an archived version of tonight's event will be available. You'll be able to find that on the parmenterfoundation.org website. Because you have registered for the event, you'll also be notified by email. And we hope that that link will be available to you as a resource for any future use or for any future sharing that you may want to do with other people. We would certainly appreciate you spreading the word about the wonderful work that not only the Parmenter Foundation is doing, but also the HEARTplay program, and invite others to join it, to register for it, and to view it after the fact as a resource for anyone who may need support for grief or other services. With that, I would like to introduce Jen Wiles. She is the executive director of the HEARTplay program. She's going to turn her, oh, excuse me, I'm jumping ahead, and Angela Crocker just jumped on to remind me of that. I'm excited. I'm sorry. First, I have to introduce Angela Crocker. Angela is the executive director of the Parmenter Foundation. Forgive me. Angela is here not only to introduce Jen Wiles, but also to share the mission of the Parmenter Foundation and to just offer a greeting as well. So Angela, my apologies. It's only enthusiasm, and a very good evening to you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you, and thank you so much for hosting this important conversation tonight. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us and taking the time out of your busy schedules for this exciting night. Before we get started, I'd also like to thank Hope Edelman for being with us, and all of the panelists who are brave and wonderful to share their personal stories with us this evening. And thank you so much to the Parmenter staff and trustees for your endless hours of help behind the scenes to make this evening possible. For those of you for whom this is a first connection with us, the Parmenter Foundation is a charitable nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting compassionate end-of-life care and bereavement for all ages in our community, and we're located in MetroWest, Massachusetts. We provide education, resources, and grants to fulfill our mission. This event is the brainchild of one of our partners, Jennifer Wiles, the director of our grantee program, HEARTplay, an award-winning children's bereavement program. HEARTplay offers services for children, teens, and young adults of all abilities who are coping with the death of an important person in their lives. All services are provided at no cost to children or their families. And at this time, it is my privilege to introduce you to the heart of this program, shepherding the program into its 26th year. Please help me to join Jennifer Wiles.
Oh my goodness, Angela, thank you so much. And thank you, Dave. I'm Jennifer Wiles. I am the director of the HEARTplay program, and it is my honor and privilege to be here with you all tonight. I am most grateful to Hope Edelman for joining us. I am I'm really indebted to the families, the children, the teens, the young adults, and all our community partners who have made this evening possible. Angela just mentioned to you our mission for HEARTplay. I'm just going to say it again because it is so important to us. It is to serve children, teens, and young adults of all abilities who are experiencing the life-limiting illness or death of an important person in their lives. So many of you in our audience today know what that feels like. And I am so grateful to Hope for writing her books, for sharing her wisdom with us, and especially for our participants tonight. I just want to say, I read Hope's book, The AfterGrief, and I was so excited about it that I was inspired to share it with my HEARTplay participants. I have a group of young adults who have been working with me for a number of years, some of them. And I thought this would be a wonderful opportunity for us all to read the book because I find it so inspiring. And a little piece of me put my brave on, as some of our participants say, and I thought I'm just going to reach out to Hope and let her know how much this book has meant to all of us. I thought she's never going to answer me, and she did right away, and we've made this connection, and she so generously and graciously offered to share her time with us this evening. So I am going to say a little bit more now about Hope Edelman, our wonderful guest tonight. I'm going to read a little bit about her and her background. So Hope has been writing, speaking, and leading workshops and retreats in the bereavement field for more than 25 years. She was 17 when her mom died of breast cancer and 40 when her father died. Events that inspired her to offer grief education and support to those who cannot otherwise receive it. And I want to say that is our mission. We want to make sure that no child or young person ever has to grieve alone. So thank you, Hope, for that. Hope's first book, Motherless Daughters, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and appeared on multiple bestseller lists worldwide. I can vouch for all my colleagues out there in hospice. We have shared this book with so many families. So many people have shared that they grew up seeing that book in their parents' homes. It's really just inspired and influenced and comforted so many people. Hope's most recent book, The AfterGrief, offers an innovative new language for discussing the long arc of loss. Her work has been translated into 14 languages and published in 11 countries. Hope is the recipient of the 2020 Community Educator Award from the Association for Death Education and Counseling, also known as ADEC. Congratulations, Hope, on that award. She is a certified Martha Beck life coach and facilitates Motherless Daughters retreats and workshops all over the world. Welcome, Hope. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. So we're going to switch our discussion over to the AfterGrief. I feel like I have this book right by my side all the time, so I'll just hold it up for a minute.
Me too.
Yes, always in our hearts. So Hope, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the AfterGrief. What inspired you to write it?
Well, Motherless Daughters had been out for about 20 years, and on the 20th anniversary of Motherless Daughters, the book was updated, or I updated the book. It didn't update itself. And I held a conference where women came in from all over the US and Canada for a day of gatherings. And that summer led a trip to an expedition to Peru with 16 motherless daughters, or co-led an expedition with the author Allison Gilbert, and was really getting an appreciation for how, especially as more time elapsed after my losses had occurred, I was carrying the loss forward differently over time. Next month will be 40 years since my mother died. I can't believe I can even say that. It sounds like so much, and it's so far away and so close at the same time. I think because she's so much a part of my work and my daily life. But I was becoming aware that there weren't many books out there talking about the long arc of this experience, particularly for adults who were bereaved as children. And there certainly weren't a lot of support services for them. I was hearing all the time from readers who said, I am about to get married, or I'm about to become a parent, and it's bringing up a resurgence of grief for me. I'm really, really missing my mom. I'm really missing my dad. I called my local bereavement center and asked if there was a group that I could join. And they asked me how long ago my loss occurred. And I said 12 years, 16 years, 20 years. And they said they didn't have anything for me. And I knew that this niche that Motherless Daughters had partially filled, which was adult women who had lost mothers when they were young, still existed, and that it was bigger. You know, it was any adult who had experienced a loss in the past, particularly when they were younger. And we know what happens to children who don't get grief support at the time of loss and all the different symptoms that may show up later in life. So I started doing research and interviewing people whose losses occurred 10, 20, 30 years in the past, and looking for patterns in their stories, the same way I did with Motherless Daughters. The real trick was trying to figure out what to call this, because in the first, 3 or 4 drafts of the book, I just kept calling it grief, like grief over the long term, or 30 years later, I'm still feeling grief. And I thought that's not really an accurate term, because I know what grief really, I think it's a great term for like that first 6 or 12 or 18 months of really acute distress. It's a perfect term for that. But we were talking about something different, the interviewees and I. We were talking about something where the edges weren't as sharp, something that was more enduring, something that could shapeshift, something that we could make choices about. And I was driving down the road one day. I live at the top of a canyon in Los Angeles. I was driving down to the ocean, and from the top to the bottom, I was thinking, what is the name for this? I was even looking in other languages. What comes after grief? What do we call the phase that comes after grief? And by the time I got to the bottom of the canyon, I thought, well, I might as well just call it AfterGrief. And I contacted my editor and said, what do you think? And she said, that's your title. So that's the story of how the AfterGrief came about, because I wrote another book that I needed, because there were so many people out there feeling like it's been 20 years since my dad died, or 30 years since my mom died, or 7 years or 10 years since my brother or sister died. What's wrong with me? Because it still hurts. I'm still sad, as if their grief should have had some kind of timestamp on it. And there was a whole large population of people feeling that maybe they had done something wrong. And I wanted to write the book that told them, no, this is how it really works.
Yes. Oh my goodness. So much of what you just said resonated with me. And I think some of our panelists who we'll hear from in a few minutes also can vouch for that. Those shoulds that we feel about grief. We should be over it. We should have moved on. We should have a different, view now. We should be healed from this. And I think, the many examples in your book, and also the many families and children that we've served in HEARTplay over the years can vouch for it. That's not the way grief works. And I'm so happy that this book provides that reassurance to people. I can give you an example of a grief group I led just a couple weeks ago, and a woman shared the story of losing her daughter and the death of her daughter and how it impacted her. And she told the story. And after she was done, she just said, "Thank you, everybody, for not asking me how long ago it was." Because that's the detail I think people often will ask first. And that is really, we're seeing such an insignificant detail.
To the mourner, it is, but to the person who's asking, they want to get a sense of what the context is. They want to know how long it's been, so that they can gauge whether or not they feel this person is doing well, right? It's a very subjective question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you answered my next question, I think, but about what you discovered, because I think we will hear more about that as we peel back the layers and ask more questions of you. But do you feel like you can kind of summarize like how it changed your understanding of life and of grief?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, I went into this feeling like I was going to write, there's no other way to say it, a feel-good book about grief that would help people feel better. That was originally, it had a different title. It went through so many iterations. And then, there were some major current events that occurred. It took me 4 years to write this book, in part because of these major current events and big events in my life too. But it took me a while to figure out what book I was writing. And I think through that process, I really changed, because I realized I needed to really understand what I wanted to say, and that I didn't quite know at the beginning. So I'll know next time not to start a book until I have a better idea of what I want to say. But I watched, the 2016 election occurred right after I got started on this book. And it really had an impact on me. And not in the I'm not being political now. I just mean that I saw half the country grieving, and quite a number of people saying, "You lost, get over it." And I thought, that is such a cultural reflex, and it's such a lack of empathy, and it's such a sense that, let's just move on, get over it and move on. And that's why the introduction to this is called getting over it. Because, this idea of getting over something, particularly grief, because I did witness people who, had put a lot of effort into that election and were actually grieving, or were grieving for, what they thought might be their own safety. And I was really deeply touched by that. And then I went on a tangent and wanted to explore, where did that come from? And it sent me down the rabbit hole into history, into studying the 1918 and 19 Spanish flu pandemic. Who knew in 2017 that was going to become useful knowledge later and for interviews? And really trying to understand how grief theory was shaped and evolved. And how it changed me was realizing these are not fixed concepts. This is the way we treat grief. It's a cultural context. It's a cultural construct. It's a historical construct. And that means it can change. So we can all get in there and change the conversation. And that gave me a lot of hope. I'm not sure that answers the question about how it changed me, but it did change the way I thought about grief.
Absolutely. And it did answer my question. And I'm just reflecting again about the comfort that brings to people who are grieving, to know we don't have to get over it, to try to shift the perspective of judgment and shame that goes along with getting it right. And as you said, when you put it in like a cultural context and a historic
Right.
this isn't the only way that we could do that. There are other possibilities. And I'm really looking forward. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to exploring that more with you this evening. I think what we would love to do is hear some of the book. I think you've chosen an excerpt from it to read to us.
And in fact, what you just said is perfect context for this excerpt. Just, it so happens, because it is about the idea of grieving right or grieving wrong, or especially when you're young and you're just following the lead of the adults around you. So yes, I'm going to read from chapter 1. And chapter 1 is called The Story of Grief, because a lot of the AfterGrief is about the stories that we create to explain to ourselves what happened and make sense of a major event or a major loss in our lives. And that story can change over time, just like, my awareness of how grief and Western culture approaches grief can change over time. So yeah, I'll just read a few pages. Is that okay?
That's wonderful. Please do.
Okay, great. Okay. So it's called The Story of Grief. I'm driving south on Pacific Coast Highway, heading for the supermarket, when a string of familiar guitar chords comes rippling across the airwaves. It's the opening riff to The Wait by the band, and Levon Helm's raspy southern baritone follows close behind. 2 lanes of traffic stream steadily ahead of me as I sing along. On my left, steep cliffs angle toward the sky. To my right, the Pacific Ocean surges and swells. Then 9 fast piano chords go tumbling straight into the chorus. Those piano chords. My mother was a classically trained pianist who could play pop songs by ear. I see her so clearly now, sitting at the upright piano in our living room, her perfectly manicured red nails rippling up and down the keyboard as she played both Chopin etudes and Barry Manilow songs. This must be what Hamlet meant by the mind's eye. It's not that memory obscures my view of the road, or that I'm dissociating from the car, but that all of these images, present and past, are equally accessible at the same time. Then comes that familiar tweak of longing beneath my ribs, the feeling of nostalgia, the feeling of home. A white Toyota abruptly changes lanes ahead of me, nearly cutting me off. I press gently on the brakes. She said, I gotta go, but my friend can stick around, Help sings. My friends say I have piano hands, my younger daughter told me the other day. Like mine, I said, we get them from my mom. We pressed our palms together to compare the length of our fingers, just as my mother and I once did on her piano bench. The pressure under my ribs expands and spreads like an ink blot, filling my stomach and chest. This is how the AfterGrief tends to show up for me now. A random sight or smell or sound pushes a memory up to the surface, and time does a funky little twitch. The future pulls back and the distant past rushes up close, both compressing into the present. Then is now and now is then and later ceases to exist. The images are dazzling in their clarity. If I'd known they were coming today, I might have planned better, like maybe not been in sole control of a 4,000-pound moving vehicle on a crowded scenic highway when they arrived. The song ends as I pull into the supermarket parking lot and turn off the ignition. I inhale slowly and do a quick check-in. Am I okay? Do I need to wait it out in the car? Nah, I'm good. As I walk into the market, comfort and sadness and yearning cling to me like sweet campfire smoke. These feelings will work their way through me soon enough. I know that by now. By the time I've pulled a plastic bag from the roll in the vegetable aisle, they're mostly gone. I didn't always understand this was possible. For many years, I thought if I allowed myself to feel the full impact of my mother's early death, the sorrow might never end. And then what? How would I function? Who would piece me back together if I fell apart? And wasn't falling apart mostly for children and the emotionally weak? At my mother's funeral in 1981, the messages I received from the adults around me, all well-meaning, no doubt, were about being strong and moving on, about getting back to life, and about how my mother wouldn't have wanted me to be sad. The implication there being that I shouldn't feel that way, and if I did, I shouldn't let anyone know. The overriding climate in our family and community was one of grim stoicism, of fortitude in the face of hardship. Emotionally, I still may have been a teenager, but practically I'd been propelled onto the turf of adult responsibility. My father would need help with my younger siblings and with running the house. Someone would have to make sure the refrigerator was stocked, doctor's appointments made, pets fed. So it was time for me to start acting like an adult. And to be an adult meant to persevere, impervious to tragedy. Those were the messages I heard, observed, absorbed, and eventually started telling myself. The past is in the past. You have your whole future ahead of you. Life goes on. To my genuine amazement, life did go on. My siblings went back to summer camp a week after the funeral. My father took about a month of bereavement leave, made possible because he worked for the family business, before resuming his daily commute into Manhattan. I returned to bussing tables at a local seafood restaurant during the week and taking tickets at a drive-in on Friday and Saturday nights. When school started in early September, I showed up on weekday mornings and handed assignments in on time. I set the table for dinner every evening as if four-place settings had always been the norm. Haircuts happened. Weekly laundry was sorted, washed, folded, and put away. To others, I imagine we looked like a family that was recovering and then like a family that had recovered. But really, we were blindly stumbling forward as if sheer momentum could propel us into a new state of equilibrium. And we did it all in a fog of silence. Within weeks of the funeral, we'd stopped talking about my mother at all. A cataclysmic act of subtraction had just occurred, yet we were working overtime to pretend nothing had changed. What was that about, I wonder now? I could and still can understand not wanting to dwell on the dying part, the images of end-stage cancer still so horrible and raw, but to stop speaking about her entirely. She'd lived for 42 years before she died, yet now it was as if she were being erased from family history. Except there she was above the yellow Parsons table in the living room, smiling down upon us from the family portraits on the wall. Her meticulously labeled spice jars were still lined up in the yellow spice rack in the kitchen. To make phone calls, we relied on her address book, where the names and numbers of all of our friends and relatives were recorded in her careful angular script. To say this was bewildering doesn't fully capture the sentiment, but it comes close. I didn't know it at the time, but my family embodied the 1970s and 80s American ethos of grief so perfectly we could have been a commercial for Reagan-era bereavement. The dominant ideology of that time was all about breaking ties and letting go after a loved one died, and we marched in time to that cultural drumbeat. Silence and pretense weren't ideal coping strategies, but they were strategies, sort of. And as a family without other tools, we became very skilled at both. That first year when I discovered how easily silence and pretense are mistaken for dignity and how dignity inspires praise. You're so grown up, your mother would be so proud. To be honest, I craved the approval. In the midst of so much wrongness, positive feedback made me feel as if I were doing something, anything right. Whatever grieving I allowed myself occurred in private behind my closed bedroom door. Fine, I said, when people asked how I was doing. I'm doing fine. Then they'd say, you're so strong, even when everything was inverted and confusing and nothing felt solid or reliable anymore, nothing at all. The truth? For the first time 5 years after my mother died, even the most bland, innocuous questions like, are your parents coming tonight? Or what was your mother's maiden name could make my heart rate spike and my limbs go cold and numb. I couldn't even say my mother without starting to cry. Neither could I remember the sound of her laugh or how she trilled good morning sunshines through the door of our shared bedroom to wake me and my sister for school. For years, the only memory I could summon was how she'd looked in the hospital at the very end. Sometimes that mental image would puncture a day without warning, jolting me with a physical charge in the middle of a complet seminar or while swimming laps in an indoor pool. Only much later did I recognize these episodes as symptoms of unaddressed trauma. At the time, my most reliable coping skill, my only coping skill really, was to avoid any agent of distress. Because in my 17 and 18 and 19-year-old mind, I had to be an adult, and for adult, life goes on. And because I should have gotten over it a long time ago, right? Well, no, none of it was anywhere close to that simple. Grief rarely is, even when it's packaged and marketed that way. Even after I'd exerted savage violence on dozens of innocent pillows, spent 100 hours in therapy, and could finally talk about my mother without breaking down. Little hot spots still flared up from time to time. If I saw an adult daughter shopping with her mother or heard a Muzak version of Mandy piped into a dentist's office, my esophagus would start to constrict. Then I'd berate myself for the lack of control. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you over it yet? When my lived experience didn't mirror the path I'd been told normal grieving should take, I assumed the failure was mine. I never considered that the definition of normal might be flawed. I'll stop there.
Oh, Hope, my heart goes out to 17-year-old you. And so many things that you just read about, I've heard reflected in the stories and the experiences of so many of the kids, teens, young adults we've served in HEARTplay over the years. Thank you for putting such an incredible voice to this experience. It's just so moving.
Thank
I'm
you,
going to let Dave take over for a minute.
It's the perfect opportunity to introduce you to some of those young adults. And I know that Hope has had the chance to meet everyone that we're going to hear from tonight who has participated in the HEARTplay program. But I think what I'm most excited about is to see the impact that not only Hope's words and encouragement have for the individual stories that we're going to get to learn in here, but I'm also excited for everyone to see the impact that Jen's program, HEARTplay, has had on these lives for all these years, and to show that despite Hope's experience, despite my mother, who was a Motherless Daughters experience as a 14-year-old, that we have grown, and we can grow together, and we can see that you don't always have to be strong, but that the strength can come from not being strong too. So let's start with Moira, and everyone's gonna turn their cameras on when it's their turn to talk, and I'm gonna hand it over to Moira to introduce herself. She's gonna share a bit of her story, and we're going to let her and Hope take it from here.
Hi, everyone. My name is Moira. I've been involved in HEARTplay since I was 6 years old, which was shortly after my older sister, Mamie Rose, passed away from a rare genetic disease. I attended as a participant in HEARTplay until I was around the age of 12. And then I transitioned to being a mentor for the younger children. And then since I've been in college, I've been involved in the young adult group at HEARTplay. And so my question for Hope is, I lost my sister at such a young age. I really grew up with grief. So I was kind of wondering how you think grief differs when the loss is at such a young age versus when the loss is at an adult. And then how do you think kind of the message of the after grief could maybe be taught to younger children in a way that might be able to help them?
Oh, well, for a long time, adults did not think children grieved any differently from adults. And that went on probably until like the mid 20th century. Now we know that children grieve very differently than adults because they are cognitively and emotionally immature, and they're picking up bits and pieces of understanding as they move through childhood. So for children, the after grief or grief itself is prolonged because what you understood at 6, Moira, is probably really different than what you could understand at 12 once you developed a capacity for abstract thinking. Maybe things that were confusing or some magical thinking from your younger years suddenly made sense or didn't make sense as you got older. And I see women over the course of a long time. So I like to say the facts of my mother's death have never changed. She will always have died in 1981 when I was 17 and she was 42 of breast cancer. But my relationship to those facts changes a lot over time. It looked one way when I was 17. It looked another way when I was 28 and started meeting other motherless daughters. It looked differently when I was 33 and my first child was born. It really looked different when I turned 42 and past the age my mother was when she died. And so the same would be true for children, that they need support and they need adults around them to help them revisit that loss and come to new understandings of it at different periods in their own development as their cognitive and emotional faculties mature. I think the most important thing that we can, do for children who are grieving is to let them know that they'll always miss their person, but that how they feel now won't be how they always feel, that it will change. When I was 17, I wrote a paragraph at the end of chapter 1, actually, I might read it about this, because when I was 17 and my mother was dying, a social worker in the hospital handed me a pamphlet about the 5 stages of grief. And she meant to be helpful because in 1981, that's what we had. That's how social workers were being taught that grief worked. And so I went through the list and I said, okay, denial, no, duh. I just got home from my mom's, literally, this was the day of the funeral. I just got home from my mom's funeral. I'm not in denial. We just buried her. Anger, yeah, I was angry, but I'm not anymore because that didn't do anything. Bargaining, I tried when she was in the hospital, didn't work. Depression, nah, I don't think of myself as someone who gets depressed. So acceptance, okay, check, 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 check. I'm at acceptance. That must be where I am. And so when 10 months later, my high school graduation came around and I really missed my mom, I was like, oh boy, I didn't do it right. I must have done it wrong. So I think, one thing that we can do to aid children is tell them there's no right or wrong way to feel. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. It will be different. It will shape shift over a lifetime. And so what I wrote at the end of chapter 1 was, I wish I'd known when I sat on my bed after my mother's funeral, checking off, I wish I'd known, I wish I'd known then what I know now when I sat on my bed after my mother's funeral, checking off stages in a pamphlet. It would have been dispiriting to hear it at the time. No doubt. If someone had told me at 17 to suit up for a lifelong open-ended quest to make meaning of her death, I probably would have said, no, thank you. But I'd like to think I would have remembered their words and that at some later point, I would have been grateful to have heard them, to have been in the presence of someone who encouraged me to imagine, even if just for a moment, that grief could be a long and awkward process of surrender instead of something that had to be quickly soldiered through. That's what I'd like in terms that children can understand, to be able to help pass on as a message from the after grief, because their experience is very, very different from adults, especially when that, they are bereaved as children.
Moira, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you gave us the objective details like Hope did about the death of your person. I'm curious about how your perspective has changed with your age?
I think that when I was younger, I didn't really understand it. I didn't really understand what was going on. I didn't really understand how it would impact me or impact my family. And I think I just didn't really know, why it was happening to me. Like, it was like, why me? Why was this happening to me, basically? And I just felt really like isolated and very alone. Like, I was the only kid who'd ever experienced this. And then I remember, like, the first time I went to HEARTplay and met all these other kids who had experienced something similar, not necessarily with a sibling, but maybe a parent or, grandparent or something, and feeling like, okay, so at least there's other people that this has happened to, and feeling a little bit like, okay, this is something that does happen in life. It did happen to me, but it doesn't have to be something that, I don't understand forever. And I can kind of, I guess, sort of take with it and, know that it's something that happened to me, and just kind of not accept it, but just, kind of understand it more, I guess.
Right. And it was a place where your grief could be validated and honored, because when a child dies, a lot of the attention and the public sympathy goes to the parents, and the siblings don't, their grief often isn't recognized in the same way, but it's monumental for them too, to have lost their playmate, their peer, their brother, their sister.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Moira, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. It's incredibly moving to hear the impact that sharing and learning and growing has had in your experience. And thank you for the wonderful answer. Moira, thank you for letting me put you on the spot too. We'll cut you loose now.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much.
I'd like to introduce Shondell. Shondell has a different story to share. Shondell was my first introduction to the HEARTplay program because of her daughter, Josephina, who I still believe is one of the most amazing people I've ever met. If we don't get Shondell up on camera, Jen will be here to ask her question as well. Let's see if she'll answer my request to pop her camera up and ask. There she is.
Hi, Shondell.
Good. Hello. Hi, my name is Shondell. I currently work for the Corey Johnson program as a community trauma healing specialist. I got involved with HEARTplay in the year of 2009 after my youngest son, Johnny, was shot and killed not far from home. He was 18 years old. Also, my husband, Terry, had passed away from complications from diabetes in March of 2004. My daughter, who is now 19 years old, participated and benefited so much from HEARTplay. Hope, I just really want to thank you and to let you know how much I really agree with your book and wish it was out a long time ago. The chapter and topic that I would like to ask is the work and process of getting it together. Why are there social rules to bereavement? There is a judgment that we feel about not grieving right. It can do so much harm. I love the different cultures process. For me, it seems so individual.
It is, it's individual, and it's also culturally relative. We were talking earlier about what grief is like in Western culture. Grief used to be a really communal social experience. In the 19th century, the Romantic era, it was perfectly acceptable to go into long periods of mourning. In the Victorian era, there were rules for how you dress and for how long, and how you decorate your house and who you can see and when. And it was very, very elaborate, very elaborate. And funerals were big and grand for those who could afford them. And then in the early 20th century, there was a convergence of events, including World War I and massive carnage on a large scale far away from home, the Spanish flu pandemic, the rise of psychoanalysis, the beginning of the modern era, women's suffrage, all of this. It's in that chapter that I think you're talking about, Shondell. And what happened was that we could not, as a culture in the UK and the US and English-speaking countries, what we think of as Western culture, and Europe, maintain those same elaborate structures, because there were just too many people dying all at once. We would have gone from one mourning period to another, or they would have overlapped. And during the flu pandemic, just like now, people couldn't gather for funerals. So funerals shrank, or they didn't happen at all. and people did not have the comfort of others. And psychoanalysis, then Sigmund Freud started writing about how grief is an internal individual process. And it left a lot of families to just have to mourn on their own without the same kind of social recognition, social status that mourners used to have. They were in a special category. They were treated very gently, very kindly. In a way, no one would have said, "Aren't you over it yet?" if you saw somebody dressed in black or even in purple or gray, because you would have known if they were in high mourning or low mourning, and there would have been codes of behavior for how to treat them very carefully, very gently. And all of that went away by the 1920s. And now we're left with the truncated versions in Western culture. But I went and investigated how grief and bereavement is treated in other cultures. And it couldn't be more different across the globe, because every culture has their own belief systems about death or the afterlife. And that filters down into, how the family would ritualize the death or treat the body or behave in the aftermath. Everything from traditional Navajo culture, which does not say the name of the deceased after they die. They can talk about them, but they can't say the name because they believe that that will impede their journey to the afterlife. To the Dagara tribe of Burkina Faso, Africa, which was that was the example that touched me the most. This is the work of Sobonfu and Melodoma Somé. When Sobonfu was still alive, she traveled around the world talking about bereavement practices. In Burkina Faso, in this particular tribe, where almost any day on the native lands, the Dagara have a grief ceremony where people can come and externalize their sorrow, whether it's because someone died or they lost a job or a friendship ended, whatever it is, so that they get it out of their body, and the community supports them and creates the space for that to happen and holds them. The closest thing I've seen to that in my experience here in the United States or in California is my daughter went to a middle school that was nature-based. And one of the fathers very suddenly and tragically died in the middle of the school year. And the school director consulted with some of his advisors, and they put together what's called a sacred fire for an entire weekend, like an eternal flame. And the whole school community and anyone in our town was invited to come and sit by the fire, which burned from Friday at the end of school until Monday at the beginning of school. And the students, the middle and high school students, were tasked with keeping the fire burning. And we sat around the fire and we all shared stories of David, and we held the family, and they were there most of the time. And the older kids slept by the fire to keep it going over the weekend. And it was a way to ritualize grief, and so that the community could come together to mourn the passing of one of its own. And that's what we were trying to recapture. And it was quite beautiful. And we were also encouraged to tell stories of anyone we loved who had died as well. There was a tree where we could hang their name on a piece of paper. It was one of the most, and now they do it every year. I mean, we live in a fire zone, so we have to get permits for it, but so we can only do it once a year. But the school now does it once a year. And I think that's really important. Did you feel that there were any parts of either Western culture or Black culture or your family culture that supported and helped you, Shondell? Because you had two major losses. Did you feel, or were you pretty much left to do it, feel like you were left to do, you and your daughter were, and your kids were there to do it on your own?
I feel like there was tradition, but I felt like we were left to do it on our own. But I just really feel like I experienced some things that, like you said, wasn't in the 5 stages of grief.
Right.
And I found that those things that I would experience, that when I talked about it, I end up being almost like, I don't know the right word, but punished for grieving. Like it wasn't part of the norm. So the way I was grieving, things I was going through, I end up getting sectioned and, impatient and understand why. But the point was that was just my way of grieving. And it didn't line with other people's way of grieving or the way that they said I was supposed to.
Right.
So by that happened, it just made me not talk about it, which turned me to do other things to deal with the pain, because it was just the pain. I needed to get the pain out. And so it took a long time before I started talking about the losses again, because I felt like, okay, you're not supposed to talk about it, or you're not supposed to feel this way.
Right. You'd been silenced by people on the outside and then absorbed those messages and told yourself that I shouldn't feel this way, I shouldn't talk this way. Because when we get a very powerful model that circulates, in popular culture, we try to fit our experience into that model. And when it doesn't, we feel like something's wrong with us instead of something being wrong with the model. There's so many different models of bereavement. So as a community trauma healing specialist, what do you tell your clients or the people that you work with? Do you express to them how individual it is and there's no right or wrong way to do it? I mean, do they believe you when you say that?
I have one line for them. It's your way, your time.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Great.
the way we want to, and as long as they need to take.
Thank you so much, Shondell, for sharing your story. Thank you for
Thank you.
sharing Josephina with the world. I wish she could be here with us tonight as well. And we'll see you back at the end.
All right, thank you.
We're going to move on to Bree, another participant in the HEARTplay program, who also has a public service announcement for us. Don't forget your mic, Bree. Hi there.
Hi, my name is Bree or Brianna. I go by Bree because that's easier for people and for myself personally. So I'm a pre-K teacher and I'm also a grad student in a special ed program. I joined HEARTplay after my mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 25. My PSA, which Jen knows I like to give because as a young woman, it was not something I was told until my mother got it, is that when you get a pap smear as a woman, they don't look for ovarian cancer. There is a gene test for it, but basically that's for like people in your family to know that you have the gene. So I just share that with the people watching because it's an important thing to know. Hope, I love your book. It's one of the things, like when you're like, oh, I want to write a book, that it absolutely helps people. Like, do not question that, please. It's so validating. I especially remember reading that first chapter and identifying with every single thing you're saying and feeling that way myself, where I was like, because in addition to all the other things I just talked about in my life, I'm also the only girl of my family. It's just my dad and my two older brothers who are both on the autism spectrum. So my question is, how do you, I'm very worried about burnout because I feel like I'm kind of everybody's mother. So I want to support, as I refer to them, my boys and my students and my friends, but like, how do you do that and also support yourself when you're grieving?
Right. It sounds like you're doing a lot of the emotional labor in your family then around the grief of, around mourning your mom in her absence. And I think it becomes really a matter of balance. And that balance means taking enough time to yourself for your own self-nurturing, or, finding it from the other people around you on your team who can offer that to you. Whether it's spending time in nature, which is a great salve because nature does not pass judgment on anybody, or exercise, externalizing some of that, your own feelings. Exercising is a terrific way to do that. Art, any kind of art that you can engage in. But, when we're generous, kind-hearted people, we want to be there for those around us. And, we will let them take up a lot of that energy. It's, but it's just like on the airplane when we say, and I know this is a cliche by now, but it's really true. You have to put your own oxygen mask on first. So supporting them means also taking care of yourself so that you can be present for them and you can be your best self with them and for them, because you're also doing that for yourself. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think probably a lot of people might identify with this too. It's just, saying no or letting people know like it's a lot or whatever.
Yes. Knowing when to say no, and that which is setting a boundary, but then sticking to it also if people transgress it or try to. Yeah. And doing it in a loving way.
Bria, I'd like to ask you, because you're caretaking in your vocation too. And I know how much emotional energy and labor that takes, especially at the pre-K level. I'd like to know, do you think that your experience drew you toward the vocation? Do you think it was something that you always need to do? Is it an outlet for you? Does it help?
I've always been drawn to that kind of work. Weirdly, so when my mother was in remission, I actually got this job and I got it via a friend. And I remember, like, before she died, she was like, you found what you need. Like, you love doing this. Like, I had always I'd worked with the elderly before. I'd worked, like helping sick people. Like, it was all these kind of niche, kind of little things here and there, but I never found something that was like, this is my thing. But I always liked helping people. But she was like, the way you talk about the kids, like, every teacher you talk to, they'll say my kids. And that's because they genuinely are like, these are my children. Like, yes, I understand I'm not, paying for their grocery bills or whatever, but like, they become a part of your heart. They really do. So yeah, to answer your question, it's always something that's been a part of me, but it's also, with my mom passing, it's kind of like one of those things too, where she like really encouraged it because she saw how happy it made me. And that's why I'm pursuing my education further, because I'd like to help more children.
Thank you, Bree. Our next question will come from Jen, because Kathy was unable to join us. But before we do that, before we let the topic that Bree was discussing go, Hope, the caretaker thread through all of this is so powerful. And I see it in your work. We see it from Bree's work. And, you see it as a hallmark through these things. The advice that you have for caretakers taking care of themselves, I think, is important. Are there other strategies? Are there other avenues to channel that?
Well, I think it's, creating a support network or team or people that you can trust and can feel comfortable being vulnerable around. This is one of the reasons why the HEARTplay group is so important, because it brings this social component of grieving back in, which is part of what we lost 100 years ago. It allows people to grieve in community and to express their feelings about grief and to experience the after grief in community. And that's a form of self-care. Bree, coming to these sessions with Jennifer and the group are a really important form of self-care. I think, because we are relational beings. And so finding those others who can understand us, who don't feel frightened or threatened by strong emotions, who can hold the space for us to have them, and, and with whom we can reciprocate, is an important part of self-care as well.
I think that also provides a wonderful introduction for Jen, who's going to read Kathy's question. But I say wonderful introduction because, Jen, I really want people to see the relationships that you build with the people in the HEARTplay program. You've been quiet through our panel discussion, but you could pop in at any time and say, oh, I know you better than that, or, oh, I know that's true because. So tell us about Kathy and share her question with Hope.
Thank you so much, Dave. And yes, I've been wanting to jump in, but I'm trying to restrain myself a little bit and let everyone.
Did we lose Jen's microphone?
Yeah, I can't hear her.
I think we did. I have Kathy's question. Jen, if at any time you speak up, I will stop. However, when we do get your audio back, I don't know what happened, but when we do get your audio back, I would like for you to share Kathy's experience with the group. But I will read her question now. And it says, my name is Kathy. My mom died 5 years ago when I was 14 years old, and she died from lung disease. She's been part of the HEARTplay program ever since and mentor younger kids and part of the young adult group. Hope, your books definitely helped me understand that I wasn't alone. Can you talk about how you see grief as an isolating experience as compared to a shared experience?
I think we partly answered that with Shondel's question, but I want to call attention to the distinction between an individual response to grief and being isolated in your own grief, because they're two separate things. Being isolated means that you're left to grieve alone, that you don't have that sense of community, that you feel that other people are either judging you or criticizing you or dismissing your grief or just not available to listen. And oftentimes it only takes one or two people at the very beginning to shut us down for us to feel like nobody wants to listen. And then we really are self-isolated in our grief. But individual responses like Chandel had brought up is something very different. I mean, your grief is going to be as individual as your thumbprint. It's going to depend on so many different factors, including your temperament, who died, what they died from, what your relationship with them was like, your culture, your ethnicity, your religion, your family systems, how much social support you have, on and on and on. So it's a very individual, it's a kaleidoscopic process. You know, every pattern is different. That's grief as an individual experience, but grief as an isolating experience is something different. That means that, you know, we have lost that social component, that sense of the community coming together to support the mourners and to have communal grief experiences. And it's something that we really, really pulled back on again during COVID, but I have been heartened to see that as the restrictions are lifted, that funerals and memorial services are being scheduled now. I did interviews earlier in this year, many of them talking about how important it's going to be, even if it's a year or two after the death, to still give people a place to gather, because that does make mourning a shared experience, and that's so important to the bereaved.
Yes, Hope. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Yes. And that last thing you said, I agree with so much. That power of ritual and community is just so vital to one's grieving experience. I don't want to say closure because I don't like that word at all, but that ritual, that shared experience is so important. And I think another thing about the shared experience that I've noticed over the years is that part of the group, part of coming together, yes, the individuals are sitting there, but also the people who have died are also a part of the group, and we make space for them. I feel that everyone on this panel, I know your people. I know their names. I know a lot about them. I feel like that's a relationship that has grown along with the grievers.
Absolutely. We say that at Motherless Daughters retreats that there might be 26 women in attendance and 2 facilitators, but there are always 56 women in the room because we're there and our moms are there as well. And we introduce our moms to the group too.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the other really important component of a shared group experience is that we're communicating to every single person there, every single kid. You matter. Your feelings matter. Your individual grief experience matters. And the way you express it matters. So as you had said earlier, in reference to Moira's experience, you know, kids often really are sometimes ignored and forgotten in a family of grievers. Sometimes people think the kids don't even know, they won't remember, they're resilient, they'll bounce back. But the truth is, you know, they don't often have opportunities to express or to share what's going on. So that's, I feel, another important part of the process of a shared experience, to really validate and empower the kids through this, and to really take the time to get to know them.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Let's introduce Sam. Hi, Sam.
Hi, my name is Samantha. I'm currently a middle school teacher. I've spent the last 2 years teaching science, and I'll be starting a new special education job in the fall. My dad died in 2016, which was about a month before his 55th birthday and 2 months before my 22nd birthday. He died of a heart attack, which really took my whole family off guard, as the week before he had his yearly physical and was told that he was in good health. I've been a part of HEARTplay for 5 years, pretty much ever since. Hope, my question for you is, how do you deal with others who try to diminish your grief if it's been a while since your person has passed?
Well, you know, it really shouldn't be, the burden should not be on the mourner to educate those who don't understand. So it's really a choice whether we want to try or not. I find that people who try to diminish my grief are typically people who have never suffered a major loss, or who have shut down, or just have a temperament where it hasn't affected them in the same way. And so I find that what I say is more for myself, so that I feel okay about standing up for myself and, for the mourner's bill of rights, than to try to change their minds. And if they are educated and learn something new, that's great. But typically what I say, if someone, intimates, wow, it's 40 years and you're still not over it yet, kind of thing, maybe not in so many words, but in, sentiment, I say, yeah, that's not really how it works. That's not really how it's worked for me. And sometimes they might be curious and say, well, how does it work for you? And then I'm happy to share. But I say that just, that's not how it works for me. Or sometimes I might say, would you like to know how it has worked for me? Because, it works that way for a lot of other people too. Or sometimes I'll say, that's not how it works for me. And you're really lucky that you don't understand that. Consider yourself fortunate that you don't know. It depends on the person, but that's typically how I handle it, because I've found, or you can hand them a copy of the AfterGrief, Samantha. Let's get you a whole stack so you can hand them to anyone who says that to you, because I think it kind of explains that we don't just get over it. But sometimes people are diminishing our grief because they don't want to have to be in the presence of someone who brings up uncomfortable feelings for them, right? Someone trying to diminish our grief almost always says more about that person than it says about us and our grief. It says they're saying, please don't act in a way that makes me feel uncomfortable or makes me feel incapable of comforting you or knowing what to do. And when we understand that, sometimes we can have some compassion for them too, instead of going to a place of feeling hurt or angry.
Sam,
Jennifer,
Sam,
I'm
I'm
sorry.
curious if, I'm sorry, please, Hope.
No, I was going to ask if Jennifer wanted to add anything to that, because maybe this comes up in HEARTplay and you might have some suggestions as well.
Yeah, I love your suggestions and your ideas. And often when I'm training volunteers and mentors to support grieving kids, I'll say, your job is not to say, oh, I understand how you're feeling, my goldfish died 5 years ago, or your job is not to diminish in that way either. And because I think what happens, that's just a silly example, but I think what happens sometimes is that the grieving person, in this case, Samantha, is in the position now to comfort and reassure the person who's giving that kind of crummy feedback, and that to me is so unfair too, that kind of shift in the role. And I love what you said, to really own your own experience and to educate rather than get defensive about it.
Sam, I was going to ask you, I'm sure some of this sounds familiar, but I was curious what's been working for you.
In dealing with others who try to diminish my grief. Typically, I try my hardest to tell them, well, everyone grieves differently and mine isn't over. I try not to get stuck in the role where I'm then educating someone on how grief works, because that's not really what they want, and that's also not what I want to be doing. So I'm just trying to learn new ways to deal with it when it does come up. So that way I'm not being rude, but I'm also not diminishing my own grief at the same time.
Right, and I think that's an important answer to your question also. How do you deal with others who try to diminish your grief? I think part of the answer to that question is to not allow them to do that, to not take on, their opinion of your grief, to maintain and understand that your grief is your grief, and it will go on in different, in different permutations, probably for the rest of your life, and to not buy into their opinion or their criticism of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Let's meet Ha.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Ha. We lost my husband to cancer when my kids were 5 and 2, and our family has been a part of HEARTplay for the last 11 years. And hope so much of what you wrote in your book resonates with our journey over the years. And recently we celebrated the 10-year anniversary of my husband's death. And we felt a little triumphant because, you know, the kids and I were reflecting, and we said, we talked about how even though we would have never chosen this path, we wouldn't wish away our loss if we could, because I love who the kids have become. I'm a totally different person. And it felt like wishing away that loss would be wishing away the people we've become and the lives we've built since. And so, you know, in your book, one of the things that sang to us was the concept of the redemption narrative, because it felt like that's where we are now. And I was wondering if you could speak more about the power of the redemption narrative, and also reconciling and making peace with the dissonance of these two opposing feelings being true at the same time. That on one hand, you know, we will be forever sad about our loss, but on the other hand, we're also forever grateful for what has come of it. And it's, you know, they're two, you know, you talk about that, but I'd love to hear more.
Well, they seem like contradictory points of view, don't they? But they're really not. You know, at Motherless Daughters retreats, we talk about how two things can always be true. And I say the human heart and the human mind are amazingly complex organisms. They can hold more, you know, more than one truth side by side. And those things can be true. You know, life can be great, and also life can be really sad at the same time. One doesn't have to cancel the other out. But what you mentioned about the redemption narrative, I'll just tell the listeners a little bit about. This is the work of Dan McAdams, a psychologist at Northwestern University, has written about this extensively, and this really influenced me. And I work with my clients, my coaching clients, and teach them the distinction between what he calls the contamination narrative and the redemption narrative. The contamination narrative is a story where everything goes from good to bad, where you had this fantastic life and then you lost your person, and everything after that has been difficult and hard and sad. The redemption narrative goes from bad to better, where you had a good life maybe, and then this person died, but then you have found a way to create meaning and purpose out of that loss. And that's really at the heart of what's known as post-traumatic growth, is that we can find or make meaning or purpose out of our loss. And I really, what you said, how it really resonates with me, how, you know, I work with women all the time who say, I'm really happy with my life right now. And so I feel guilty because does that mean that I wish my mother were dead? And I said, look, you're not getting a choice. It's not like someone's going to say, would you rather have your mother here or have everything that you have in your life? Like, these are just, you know, cognitive games we play with ourselves because we don't get that choice. That choice was taken away from us. So we might as well be happy and grateful for what we have now, right? Because that's what we have. And I find that to be, for me, particularly inspiring. You know, when I'm leading Motherless Daughters retreats, I'm standing there and I'm thinking about my mom all the time. Am I glad that she's not there? Of course not. Do I miss her? Of course I do. But I'm also acknowledging that if my mom hadn't died at the age of 42, would all these women be in this room together having this experience? I never would have written that book. Would someone else have written it? Would there have been a way for, you know, them to come together and get the healing that they need? So I'm grateful that something good came out of it. And it sounds like you're allowing your boys, I think that's wonderful. You're allowing the boys the space to acknowledge that, to not feel like my life is always going to be difficult and hard and sad because my dad died when I was young. They can say, I have a really sad event that happened in my past and I really wish my dad were here, but I'm capable of recognizing that good things have come out of that. Mm-hmm. And that is the redemption narrative. I think you're giving your children a great gift, by you know, giving them the space to feel that, but also to genuinely be able to feel it yourself, because you know, you're modeling that behavior for them.
Thank you.
I want to say to Ha and Chandel, to what incredible parents they are and how they have raised their children while being heartbroken themselves, to discover that capacity for growth through this really hard time. I also wanted to add a little bit more to that, Hope. I loved your answer. And I want to say in HEARTplay, we have a mentor program, as a few of the panelists have mentioned. And that is another thing that I have witnessed with kids who have grown up with grief. They have an incredible capacity for empathy and for compassion for others. And it's really demonstrated for me in how incredibly kindly and humbly, they mentor younger kids who are grieving. And I think of all the things we do in HEARTplay, that is one program that gives parents so much hope. Like they see these older kids who have gone through it themselves, yet have the capacity for compassion for others, and they can set that example. And to me, everyone here is a shining example of that. They understand what it's like to have a broken heart, and yet somewhere in them, they have found that resource to be there for others.
And Jennifer, to add to that, the groups and workshops that I lead on both online and in person are deliberately multi-generational for that reason, because the women who are further along on the path find it so gratifying to be able to share their wisdom and their experiences with the younger women. And the younger women are so eager to learn from the older women and see what might it be like, you know, to get married without my mom there, to have a child and become a mother without my mom there. And, you know, it's interesting because sometimes the younger women will say, like the women in their 20s, early to mid 20s will say, I want to come to this event or this workshop or retreat because I want to see what it's going to be like for me 30 years from now. And I say, that's a terrific reason to come, because there will be women there who can show you that you're going to have a wonderful life in many ways. I said, but you're not going to be like them because you're coming here now. And they didn't get this 30 years ago. So it is going to be a little different. You're going to be on a different path, because if you can get that kind of support and that kind of education earlier, it can save, you know, many years of derailments, that, as the older women say at our retreats. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to make sure we put Hope's website and information about her programs in the chat as well.
Sure, I'll drop it in. It's really easy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hope.
If I could add one thing to what Jennifer was saying about HEARTplay, I think that's, you know, for our family, of course, we love the program, but one of the most hopeful things for us is the fact that, you know, when we tell people about HEARTplay, you know, I sort of, their expression, you know, starts with as one of like, you know, this, you know, sorry expression on their face. And really what I think of HEARTplay now over the years, it's not this place where, you know, we all go and, you know, feel sad. It's so hopeful, you know, and the fact that these kids can become mentors, you know, I feel like the program, you know, helps families grieve, but really it puts more goodness back out into the world, because these kids really grow stronger, they grow more empathetic, and they really want to turn their loss into something positive. They really, I mean, Jennifer, you really send them back out in the world ready to help. And I think that's one of the things I love about what you do in the program. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ha. And I think this discussion is a beautiful segue to Kelly, who's next, right, Dave?
Yeah, and before we introduce Kelly, I want to remind everyone who's joining us that this is your chance to enter any questions into the Q&A panel for Hope. We will have time for questions with Hope after Kelly's question. So use the icon at the bottom of your screen to enter a question. They'll be filtered through, and Jen and I will bring them to Hope to ask and to respond to. So Kelly, that's your cue to join us, and take it away.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I was 5 years old when my mom passed away from breast cancer, and I started coming to HEARTplay. So I've now been coming for almost over 15 years now. I just graduated nursing school, and I just accepted a job in Boston as a nurse. And I think even though so much time has gone on since my mom's death, I try to think of her every single day in something that I do. People always say that I have my mom's laugh, so I try to laugh as much as I can. My question for Hope is, how do you continue to honor your mom in your life?
You mean me, my mom, or?
Yes.
Oh, well, I think I do it every day through this work. I talk about, so let me first answer that, how I publicly honor my mom. Because I publicly honor her in this way that is almost performative, you know, by writing the books and leading support groups and talking about her. But sometimes I have to draw back and remember that my mom is not a commodity. My mom is not a character to be shared with other people. My mom is my mom. And so how do I honor her in my own life is by telling stories about her to my daughters, having items of hers around my home that I, you know, have touchstones with. I have a Waterford cut crystal, I think, or cut glass vase that she got as a wedding gift. It comes from my parents' house, and I keep flowers in it all the time. So it's always really prominent in my living room. And whenever I look at it, I think of my parents. I have reminders around in a very personal way, but also I strive to embody some of her traits or qualities that I admire most. She was an educator. She was also extremely altruistic. She did a lot of volunteer work. So I do a lot of work on the side, for free. Jennifer said she was surprised I answered the email. That's one of the things I do. I answer all my emails. People are like, are you kidding me? I mean, it's not like I get thousands a day, but I do take time sometimes where I'll just, set aside a couple of hours and just go answer all the emails from readers, because if they're taking the time to reach out to me, I want to reach back to them personally. And so that is a way that I honor my mom, I think, by doing that kind of, or devoting time to making those connections and doing that, which for me is like almost a form of volunteer work, because it's, it is something that I choose to do. And I think it's important. She was also very committed to social justice. So supporting social justice causes is another way that I honor her. And sometimes, I'll make donations in her name or tell people about her, or support causes that she would have supported as well. Sounds like you found ways to honor your mom too. I love that people tell you that your laugh is like hers, so you try to laugh a lot. That's so beautiful.
We have the same laugh. So one time someone stopped me and they were like, I thought Jennifer was in the room. I thought it was her,
Ooh,
but it was me.
wow. Do you remember your mom? Do you remember much about her?
Bits and pieces. She took a lot of pictures, so we have a lot of that, but no, not as much. As I get older, I find it's harder. It was easier when I was younger, but not really now.
We have a lot of women in the Motherless Daughters community who were really young when their moms died, like up to age 6 or 7, and their memories are very few, and they self-identify in a special category. They say it's hard to mourn someone that you can't remember.
Yeah.
You're mourning the absence, but not the person as much. So we're thinking of doing affinity groups or verticals, like special groups. And one of the first ones we'll do is just for women who were very young when their moms died. We also did, I say we, meaning my tech team and my marketing team, and I did a free live event just on very early loss. Jennifer, I'll make sure you have that link for anyone in your community who wants to watch it, because I think it's just up on YouTube now. We made it out there in the world for free, where we talk about what it's like to lose someone when you're very, very young. And then the women in attendance talked about what it had been like for them and has been like for them.
Yes, thank you, Hope. I think that's wonderful to give a voice to those people, because I think often they might feel marginalized with all the grief work, right? That they don't have those memories to really share, to draw on. So yes, thank you. That would be wonderful. Kelly, can I just put you on the spot a little bit too, because you have been a mentor in the programs. And can you talk a little bit about your experience, coming as a young child to HEARTplay, looking at the mentors and then becoming one yourself, and how that was for you?
I loved it. It helped me a lot, especially with guiding my future. And I've always felt a little bit older than my friends, even though I'm the youngest person in my grade. I don't know. Like my friends always joke, I'm like the mom of the friend group. I think HEARTplay really helped shape that a lot. I think I never really felt as alone. I did in school because I would get separated from everyone, like if we were doing a Mother's Day craft or something. But there, I loved my experience. I went to Camp Erin. I still bump into the girls that I went to Camp Erin with sometimes, like in town or like around it. So I love my experience. Even in college, I would go sometimes if like to mentor. I loved my experience there so much. And I tell everyone about it now. Even on job interviews, people ask about it and I'll explain like what it is. And people think it's such a great thing. And people don't realize how much of a resource it is. So it's a great experience. And I loved this opportunity.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you for your input and your responses, Hope and Jen. We do have one question. I'd like to read it, and I'd also like to, answer this question, Hope, maybe on two different vectors. And Jen, I would certainly encourage you to chime in as well. This question is from Margot Conley. I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to ask for a secondary follow-up to it. I know this is mostly about grief for people, but do you have any suggestions for loss of pets? The grief is real, And some say harder than grieving a person because of the unconditional love. And naturally with pet owners, they get the same dismissive messages that we've been discussing about tonight. You know, oh, it's just a dog, or, you know, the worst words in the world, get over it. I ask you that specifically to answer Margot's question, Hope, but I also ask you that question to maybe, I think there's a lot of virtue in shortcuts. I don't think that there needs to be any guilt around taking shortcuts. So if there are shortcuts to either avoiding, or we discussed responding to, but maybe educating where there is the will to educate people. It's certainly not the responsibility in the grieving person's Bill of Rights to have to educate, but where there is a will to educate, what can you do?
Well, I think, you know, there are a number of people, including myself, who are very emotionally invested in our pets. And that's what we're grieving, is the loss of that emotional connection. And like you said, that reciprocal, unconditional love, especially, you know, for people who live alone, the pet's a companion too. And there's a whole relationship that's developed and a form of communication that's been lost. I don't cover pet loss in my books because I feel like then I am equating pet loss with adult loss. And I do think it's very different, but I don't think it's any less painful for those who have, you know, spent 15 years living, you know, together with another sentient being that has loved them, you know, unabashedly. And, you know, I lost a cat a few years ago, our cat of 13 years, and I was really torn up about it. We are deciding now whether to sell the family house. And one of the hardest things for me around that, selling that house, is leaving the pets buried in the yard. Like, I feel like I'm leaving them behind. And that's real. You know, I remember a therapist said to me, you know, around the cat, is it bringing up any feelings around losing your mom? And I thought, that is a silly question. My mom died when I was 17. My cat just died a few, you know, weeks ago. Of course, it's not bringing up anything from my childhood loss of my mom, but a couple months later, what do you know, right? I was feeling quite a bit of guilt about this cat's death because I had not gotten a second opinion in time because I was so busy. And then it brought up, you know, the sort of like the somatic memory of feeling guilty around some things when my mom and my dad had died also. And I thought, oh, she was onto something. I should not have been so dismissive myself, you know, so I learned something in that experience as well.
And I just want to say thank you, Hope. And I think your cat's name was Timmy, if I recall.
How do you remember? Yes.
I have a thing with names. And I want to say to Margot, I feel it. And this year, actually, HEARTplay did a pilot program with Angel Memorial.
I think we lost Jen's
audio again,
but that would be a good chance for me to plug Angel Memorial, who does a wonderful job with pets and loss and pet bereavement. Hope, we are at another generational sort of inflection point. Oh, Jen, you're back. You know, you talked about Victorian times and how much more grace and help was offered to people who are grieving. So I wanted to ask you if, you know, I think we all play God for a day in our minds sometimes. If we're at this, you know, inflection point after another pandemic and around such sort of incalculable loss, if you had the magic wand to create a different sort of societal expectation, a different rubric for the way we supported each other in Western culture, here in our community, let's just take MetroWest Boston. What would you prescribe?
I would prescribe something like the Sacred Fire, where people have a place to come every year or a couple times a year where they feel like they're part of a community that will hold them if they need to release their grief. I would create programs that follow people over the long arc of loss. I'm looking into doing that myself, piloting programs, you know, that really support people, so that when someone calls a bereavement center or can come to a center, but, you know, maybe a designated center, and saying, you know, my dad died 12 years ago and I'm about to get married and, you know, I'm walking down the aisle myself, I'm having a really hard time, that there will be those kinds of services and support for them. And I think a growing appreciation also of what repressed or delayed or unexpressed grief can do to the body and the spirit and the mind. And also, I think a more of an awareness and an appreciation for the spiritual component of grief, because I think of grief as having a couple different touch points. There's the psychological and the emotional, which we think about all the time. There's the physical and, the harm that it can do to our bodies, or, the sleeplessness, the loss of appetite, the stress on our cardiovascular system. There's the physical, there's the social, which we've touched on, but then there's the spiritual too. And the spiritual often gets conflated with religion. And I don't think, and that's part of it. It is. And there are certain religions that do a really good job in helping their members, whether it's through social support or through traditions or rituals. But I also think that when you lose somebody, it's an existential crisis. And to me, that's spiritual. And giving people the place and the opportunity and the permission to talk about how that, their fears about where did someone go? Someone was here yesterday and they're not here today. And where did they go? And be able to do that in a secular or non-denominational way, and just say, this is a wound to my spirit, and my worldview, and to be able to have a language around that and to cultivate places for those conversations to happen as well.
Jen, do we have you back?
Can you hear me now? Thank you, Hope. That was beautiful. I just didn't want to leave that pet loss question hanging. So I did put my email in the chat. We do have programs for pet loss. I feel it's, as I said, it's kind of uncharted, unexplored territory, but the losses are real, and we would be happy to speak with you more about that in HEARTplay.
So we're coming to the conclusion of our program. We have a couple housekeeping items to take care of, but before we do, I wanted to ask both of you for some final thoughts. And I thought that the nice way to do it was to spin this program forward to anyone who may discover it as a resource after we sort of hang up here in the next couple of minutes. So Jen, maybe I'll start with you, and I'll let Hope have the last word. What invitation would you offer to any sort of story that we could conceive here in our mind, to the person that has bottled it up for the 40 years and made the grief choice not to confront it, but has decided that tomorrow is the day they start, or to the person watching the other person struggling with it and having a hard time themselves finding the words to offer the grace or the empathy, or to the person talking to the child. We've shared these personal experiences. We've had our own individual shared experience, community experience, individual stories. But what's your invitation to the next person who watches?
I would say be a good listener, open your heart and listen, and be aware of the resources that are available. I think often when there is a death, sometimes people say, what can I do? If there's anything I can do to help, let me know. And I would say to those people to maybe pass on information about HEARTplay, information about the Parmenter Foundation, and certainly information about Hope's work and books. That's something concrete that people can do. And I would say at HEARTplay, our door is always open, and we serve people of all abilities. Everybody grieves, and everybody has a right to grieve in their own way. So we are open to all.
Mm-hmm.
And Hope, the last word is yours.
You mentioned something about people who feel like now is the time. Maybe they have had delayed grief for reasons that, maybe they were in survival mode for a long time or didn't feel safe enough or didn't have the support that they needed. I hear from a lot of the mourners that they're afraid that if they allow themselves to really feel the pain of grief, they will start crying and never stop. Which is, of course, a metaphor. They're afraid the sorrow will never diminish because it is physiologically impossible to start crying and never stop. Our bodies are not equipped to do that. But it is, I think, essentially important to find ways to externalize those emotions, whether it's through physical activity or speaking about them or painting or, some form of art or writing or journaling. But I think the last thing I'd like to say is that we often in this culture in particular, think of vulnerability as our kryptonite. but it can also be our greatest strength. And to remember that.
I couldn't agree more that sometimes it's the vulnerability that provides you the path to the greatest strength. And I wonder at both of your ability to share and to identify and to remember names and to connect and to build these communities as you both have to help people in some of the most difficult time periods in their life. And I thank you for that. But I can't help but wonder even more that what remarkable listeners both of you are. And of course, that is such a critical component of this, but I still don't want to let the moment slip away and just marvel at just what extraordinary listeners both of you are. And my greatest thanks and gratitude just for you including me in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you, Dave, so much.
And you are a wonderful interviewer. Those were terrific questions.
Thank you. Before I get to the housekeeping, I want to invite all of our panelists to reopen their cameras. I believe I turned one off, so I'm going to try and remember who that was. But we have a special close that we're going to finish with. And before I do that, I'd like to invite all of you who are still joining us before we say goodbye to go to the ParmenterFoundation.org for resources that you may need for bereavement and end of life. Go to HEARTplayprogram.org to learn more about the HEARTplay program. You can learn information about both programs available to you in MetroWest and more resources that can connect you to those things. You can learn how to volunteer and how to give. And for Hope Edelman, I would point you to motherlessdaughters.com and the AfterGrief.com for more information about her books, about her programs, and ways to stay connected. And you know she answers her email.
I do.
So I will point that to you as well. As a registrant to this program, you will receive a follow-up email that will provide you a link to the archived recording of this program. Please share it. Please connect anyone who in any area, whether it's MetroWest Boston or anywhere around the world, to gather more resources, hope and encouragement and help that they may need in their own arc of loss. With that, I am going to turn it over to Jen, who is going to lead us through one final shared community experience.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much to you and everyone at the Parmenter Foundation for hosting this incredible evening. And of course, thank you, Hope. For those of you who know, I usually have a candle, always have a candle going for all our groups. And I light it in memory of all the people who have died that we are honoring today. I also light it in honor of the panelists here, our HEARTplay community, and our audience too. Thank you for joining us. Kathy, who was one of our panelists, couldn't be here. She communicates sometimes in American Sign Language, and she taught us the signs for growing through grief. So I thought we could end with that today, and I'll show you how it is. Maybe we can all do it together. So growing, the sign for growing is like a little, you make like a little flower pot with your hand, and then your other hand comes up like you're blossoming like a flower. That's growing. And then grief is your two hands over your heart, twist, like your heartstrings are being twisted a little. So we're going to do that together, growing through grief. So here we go, growing through grief. Be well, everyone, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you to all who have joined us. Thank you, Hope Edelman. Thank you, Jen Wiles, and have a wonderful evening.